Exec of the Association for Consultancy and Engineering. Very welcome to you this afternoon on our webinar. This is the third instalment in our webinar series, all about navigating COVID-19. And this series is focused on helping our members and the wider industry move through the difficult times ahead. So the topics we covered already in this series are things like emergency support, specific support for SMEs, and today we're looking at procurement. And I'm very pleased to say we've got some brilliant panelists, and unsurprisingly, this has proved our most popular webinar to date. So no pressure for our panelists, but you're very, very much in demand. So thank you for taking the time out of what will be a particularly busy schedule at the moment, I'm sure. So we have two guests from Crown Commercial Services. So they are the procurement arm of the Cabinet Office. So thank you very much to Samantha Ulyatt and John Welch for being here today. They're going to shortly cover the recent policy procurement notices that have been issued and actually what they mean for the construction sector. So we've got a really brilliant opportunity with our experts here today to actually understand that and make sure that we're interpreting it in the right way. And then we'll be bringing in an old friend, Alasdair Reisner, who is my equivalent as the Chief Exec of the Civil Engineering Contractors Association, to just talk through a little bit about how his members are responding to these policy notices and actually what they can do to support their supply chain through this period of disruption. Just on the format of today, we're going to have these two presentations, about 15 minutes each. And then after the presentations, we're going to leave time for Q&A. So in terms of how we actually do that, if you are new to this, you'll notice on the side, the right-hand side, there will be a panel where you are able to ask questions. So the idea is you type your questions in, and then when we get to the Q&A session, I pick those up and I will field those as the chair. I'll field them to our experts. So we will try and get through as many as possible. And please do keep adding your questions to the panel because you don't lose them. So as we're going through the presentations, if you have a question spring to mind, please do pop it into that box and we'll collate them up at the end and ask those back to our experts. If we don't get through them all, we will make sure that we come back to you with the specific answers in a sort of follow-up email. So please do make sure you ask your questions. If possible, listen to us through headphones. We can't hear you, so it doesn't matter if you're having challenges with children or animals in the background, but it's probably best if you do try to listen through headphones so that you can hear us. A final point from me, just before I hand over to our speakers, is that we are going to be recording this. Not that there will be any swearing, but please no swearing. But we are going to record this webinar and it will be uploaded to the website. So if you miss something, recognising a lot of the things we're going to be talking about are probably very technical on this call, you will be able to watch it back just to make sure that you can fully absorb what we're discussing. So it's an exciting sort of bedtime job for you there, watching this back if you can't sleep. So I think without further ado, I'm going to now hand over to Sam and John from Crown Commercial Service, who are going to take us through some of the policy procurement notices that have been issued very recently in response to COVID-19. So Sam and John, over to you.
Okay, thank you for that, Hannah. Sam, are you okay kicking off with the first slides? Is your audio okay, or do you want me to carry on? Okay, all right, no problem. Sam may be having some problems with audio there, so I will kick us off. Well, as you will have seen, there have been two specific policy procurement notes responding to COVID-19 that Cabinet Office have published. First one is 01/2020, and this was around guidance to contracting authorities that needed to procure the goods and services with extreme emergency. So there's two aspects to this, and it's captured within the PCR regulations 2015. And that's an important point, actually. This is just the PCR regulation, so it doesn't capture the defence and security public contract regs or utility regs, etc. For this specific PPM, excuse me. But it advises and guides contracting authorities on how to take advantage of the flexibility, the narrow flexibility in the procurement regs in situations like this, predominantly around directly awarding contracts in an extreme emergency. So from a Crown Commercial perspective, we have, as most public sector frameworks do, they have the ability to direct award anyway, but the jurisdiction around that are very tight. In the situation we find ourselves in today, there's a lot more flexibility around customers needing to use that extreme emergency measure, given the unprecedented times that we're in. Now, it shouldn't be abused. Customers shouldn't just be relying upon it for a quick route to market. They should be justifying internally why they need to choose to use the direct award allocation under extreme emergency measures. And also importantly, it doesn't absolve the contracting authorities' responsibilities for using and accessing the market via a tried and tested procurement route, which has followed OJU compliant requirements. So a lot of flexibility allowed in this situation, but there's still a duty-bound contracting authorities to follow the regulations where they possibly can. A good example of where Crown Commercial service have had to abide by this type of rule and have taken advantage of it is in our building materials and equipment agreement that we have live. We've taken the opportunity to extend that by 12 months from October this year to October next year. And that's for two reasons. That's largely to give the customers the flexibility that need to use it. As you would expect, the demand is significant around PPE and building materials and equipment, given the situation that we're in. And we need the departments to be able to have that route to market without constraints around them. But also, as the public sector and civil servants all rally around to support the government in everything we're trying to do to achieve success and mitigate the issues that are being caused by COVID-19, it means business as usual is disrupted. And therefore we've taken the opportunity, not just on this one, but a couple of agreements of ours that had 6 months or less remaining to enact that extension under these regulations. So if you are talking with departments, then there's the ability for them to use the agreements that Crown Commercial have in a flexible way that protects them and allows them to do so in such unprecedented times. Moving on to slide 2, from the CCS perspective, this is about public procurement policy note 02/2020. We need to do something with these numbers. And essentially this is a publication around supplier relief, and it is for a finite period. It ends June 2020, so the end of June 2020. And this was Cabinet offices and government's recognition that we are in these unprecedented times and there are going to be projects, contracts, etc., that will be disrupted by the situation we're in. So the guidance and advice is around how to relieve suppliers of some of their obligations, but also support them from a financial perspective. And this is supply chain throughout. So this isn't just the tier ones, if I could use that example, where government have a direct contract with. This is that tier one supporting the tier two, the tier 3s, 4s, etc. And it's really important that whenever a department calls upon some of these supply relief provisions set out, that they are done so on an open and transparent basis. It's referred to as open book in these slides here. What that doesn't mean is if you are on a particular lump sum type of contract now, then you flip to open book or cost plus reimbursable. What it means is during this period, if you have taken or needed to have taken advantage of these supply relief provisions, you do so on an open and transparent, fair and reasonable way. Because some of the provisions available are around prepayment or payments on ordering in advance, paying invoices on receipt, as opposed to goods receipt, etc. So, you know, the government have gone a good distance, in my opinion, to trying to support suppliers in this situation. We recognise that there needs to be further guidance or FAQ type approach to the relief provisions available in this PPN from a construction perspective, and we've been working on those for the past few days. Hope to get a publication out early next week to respond to some of the questions that we've had from industry to help the suppliers, but also the departments in interpreting what those requirements are or how they can practically implement the provisions and the relief measures set out in 0220. As you can imagine, they were drafted covering all sectors across the UK. Clearly, we need to support you guys in this context, as well as the other supply chain members of the construction industry, and interpreting those in the right way. Very complex, given the numbers of forms of contracts that we use. Even more complex where bespoke contracts are being used. You know, arguably, maybe this is an opportunity for us to work better with a standard form of contract moving forward, as opposed to the amendments that often go on. Because in this situation, we can't cover every eventuality because we don't know necessarily all the bespoke provisions that suppliers may use throughout their supply chain terms and conditions as well. So we're trying our best to interpret the PPN into FAQs that it will be really helpful for the supply chain. And as I say, hopefully they'll be published early next week. Finally then, on slide 3, this is just a reminder of where these resources are available. So the notes and the guidance are detailed currently. Read them online, go to the gov.uk website. There will be further PPNs being released, as well as iterative updates to the existing PPNs. You know, the situation we're in, I've said it before, is unprecedented. We need the time to be able to test some of these things and learn from what could be done differently. So these will be an iterative process of updating these PPNs and FAQs. So please feed any queries that you have in directly to the Crown Commercial Help Desk website there, info@crowncommercial.gov.uk. And finally, there's further guidance on COVID-19 for individuals, employers and organisations on gov.uk. It gets updated regularly. You see the public announcements from government anyway, but everybody on this call will fit into one or both or all of those categories listed there. So please take advantage of the guidance that the government's publishing, and I guess be patient when it's being published. It's unprecedented times for all of us. Okay, thank you.
Brilliant. No, thank you very much, John. And I think I'd just underline there, I think, you know, the PPNs that have been put out are fantastically helpful, actually, and I'm pretty bowled over at the quality of them. You know, there is an awful lot in there which has been carefully thought through in a very short space of time that's really, really valuable to supporting the sort of viability of industry in the short term. So I think certainly for those who haven't maybe read the detailed sort of PPNs yet, it's absolutely worth doing that. They're very accessible. So please do make sure that you read through that. And then I said, we'll come on to the questions about it. I mean, you know, there is an awful lot, isn't there, in there, John, about, you know, how if your site's disrupted, or, you know, if there's been disruption to the service that you're contracted to deliver, there's an awful lot of flexibility being introduced to allow, you know, the sort of public bodies to really support the supply chain through this. So make yourselves aware of the rules. And I will just remind everybody to please keep sending in your questions, because like I said, I think that's a brilliant overview from John. We've got the opportunity while he's here to really delve into some of the questions you might have. So, you know, if you are being disrupted at the moment, if you do work on government procurements, please do post your questions, because as we say, there is probably quite a lot of clarification required given the pace at which some of these PPNs have been developed. So thank you very much, John, for that.
Thank you, Anna.
No, thank you. So I'm just going to move on to Alasdair now, introducing Alasdair, who is a man who will have read the full PPNs as I have, and is going to give a perspective from the contracting point of view around the response to those, and also what it means for the supply chains associated with the contractors. So Alasdair, over to you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and I hope you can hear me. I've just had something flash up to say I've got some slight broadband issues, but hopefully I'm coming through clearly. First thing I would say is a couple of notes of thanks. First to ACE, while this has been an extremely challenging time for industry, I think one of the positives has been how the industry has worked collaboratively to help each other out, and putting on things like this webinar and opening them up to the whole industry, I think is really helpful. Second thanks is to Crown Commercial Services. So I've been doing this job long enough that I remember the financial crisis, and we were having to go around lobby individual clients to provide support to the supply chain. So we thought we'd have to do that this time. And actually the publication of both procurement policy notes were almost exactly what we would have asked for had we had to go out and do the ask. So that's brilliant proactive responsiveness from the government, which is something that I'd say has been characterised by a lot of the stuff we've seen. However, today I think my role is to really talk about almost that step down from what John's been talking to us about, so how my members and others that act as a sort of a primary contractor, a primary consultant, can support their supply chains. So if we can move on to the slides. I think if we move past that slide as well. So yeah, so I've split this into three sections. One is around where companies are choosing to continue to work, because that's a live issue for a lot of sites across the country. As part of the work that we've been doing, we have been doing the industry survey that many of you will have filled in if you've been really reading the daily newsletter. Our understanding is probably now somewhere up north of 60% of sites across the country are closed. But there are quite a number that are still open, in line with government guidance, it should be said. The government guidance is clear at the moment that construction should continue where that can be delivered in compliance with Public Health England or Public Health Wales or Public Health Scotland guidelines. Obviously in Scotland, the Scottish Government has taken a different view on that, but generally speaking, the government for the UK has indicated that work should continue where you can do so safely. However, that does not mean that individual sites are not making their own decisions, and I think that's right, that people should be able to take a view. So I suppose the question is, when it comes to a decision to continue work, what do you need to do in relation to your supply chain? So I think there it's about discussing the challenges that may arise. We know that for a number of subcontractors, they are experiencing people being off ill. They're experiencing people who are choosing not to come to work, and that if you don't have the people, it's not reasonable to just say, well, that's your problem. I think we need to be working collaboratively as an industry to try and address some of these issues. Similarly, materials. I think the Minister yesterday was quite clear that he did wish for builders merchants to remain open, but we are definitely seeing capacity constraints on materials that are required for projects. So again, that's something where suppliers will have a distinct insight on that. It's important to have that discussion. And finally in that, it's the requirements around the SOPs. If there are particular things, things like hand sanitizer, if the thing that would act as a barrier to your supplier working on site is that they can't get access to that, there seems to be a common sense approach that needs to be taken where you provide support if you can in that area. And that leads on to the need to brief on those SOPs. Don't take it as read that all of your supply chain will know and understand the site operating procedures. As part of the discussion, sorry, we go back a slide. Do take it as read. Do make sure that you're briefing about those site operating procedures so that everyone understands the new way of working on sites. If you are seeing challenges around availability of resource. This doesn't necessarily mean that work needs to stop. I think what we're seeing is clients, tier 1 contractors, are amending the scope of the work to be done so that it can be delivered within the constraints of the available resource and within the health guidelines. And I suppose the key point here is sort of to be sensitive around supply chain positions. I think what's been positive, I think, is that we would say that most of the companies that we're dealing with seem to be having an open and collaborative relationship. However, I'm not going to lie to you, I've seen some fairly foul letters being written from both sides of the equation around people getting very contractual very early. Someone on a call I was on earlier today talked about, you know, we're in a war situation, and I think it is like that. This is not business as usual. This is a scenario where the sort of the standard ways that people have perhaps operated from a commercial point of view in the past just don't wash right now. So I think it's with everyone trying to help each other out is the best way forward. I do recognise that that's not going to happen across the piece, but it does feel like the way that we're going to find our way through this most effectively. Finally, there's a quick point around the government's provisions around job retention. There's a particular challenge for supply chain if they're being called in and out on a regular basis, because if you're furloughing off your workers, as companies are being encouraged to do when they don't have any work, and then you're being called in but for a day's work, and then you're bringing those guys off furlough, there's then a barrier for when they can go back off, because there's got to be a 3-week gap at the moment. So I think sensitive management of program to ensure that people aren't being brought in and out all the time seems a sensible thing to do. So if we can move on to the next slide. So the flip side of that equation is where you are choosing to stop work, or where you have been asked to stop work. I think here, from the supply chain point of view, clarity is key. The sooner they know, the sooner they can make their own provisions, sooner they can implement furloughing, sooner they can do everything that they need to protect their business if work is stopping. A particular point there is making sure that people have access to site. You know, if you've got hired plant as a subcontractor, but you can't actually get back onto the site to return that to your hirer, and you face liabilities associated with that, that's the kind of thing that can bring down a company. So ensuring that there is access prior to the closure of the site is important. Similarly, we recognise that theft is likely to be a big issue with closed sites. Because unfortunately there are people out there that will take advantage of this situation. So if the supply chain does have assets on sites, taking steps to make sure that those assets cannot be removed. Obviously, we would want you to have a conversation about how the suspension will be dealt with commercially without it all getting very adversarial very quickly. And I would hope that, again, both sides of the sort of client-supplier relationship there would do so positively. And finally, it's about outlining the proposals for how and when work will restart. Clearly, that may well be a moving feast in terms of we don't know when we're going to be getting back, but it is good to have a plan for how it's going to happen when it happens, so that everyone can be in the interim period, making sure that they are ready to go when the green light is given. And then we'll go on to the final slide. And this will look fairly similar to some of the stuff that John said, particularly around PPN 02 2020, because the supply chain relief should not stop from the main public sector client going down to the tier 1. It should go down, as it says in that procurement policy notice, it should go right down through the supply chain. So we would hope to see the same types of measures implemented as you go down the supply chain. So that is about identifying the potential at-risk suppliers, brief those companies on the support that the government has made available. While I know that the industry is facing enormous challenges at the moment, I don't think anyone could say that the government has not made big steps to try and address those. So try and ensure that people are aware of that support that's available to them. Have a discussion about the financial commercial issues on site. and seek where possible to make earlier payment. That obviously is difficult if you yourself as a business are facing your own cash flow challenges, but if possible, pay early in order to secure that supply chain, because you're going to need them as you come out the other end. Particularly, obviously, that is the case where you are getting paid faster as a result of the measures in the procurement policy note. So those are sort of the key points that I think we've picked up on in relation to relationship between contractors and supply chain, but I'm happy to take any questions from those that are listening into the call.
Brilliant, thank you, Alasdair. And I think that's, it's great as well to see, CECA working with their members to translate this, because as you say, it doesn't stop with government making policy. We need to then make sure that that does reach all parts of the supply chain. So I think it's really positive to hear that. Certainly something that, as far as my members are concerned, we hope translates into action, but that's where we come in to work together. So just to remind people, please do keep sending in your questions. We've got a reasonable amount of time now, and we've got some questions coming through already, but we've got plenty of time if you want to send some in. So I shall start with a question, probably to both of you actually, so both John and Alasdair. It's a question in relation to the FAQs you mentioned, John, around, in relation to the PPNs. So when are those going to be available? Are they available already? And in particular, how, what's the process for cascading those out into the arm's length body? So this person has mentioned specifically on Network Rail, and, quite clearly there's probably a big need to get some of this new guidance out into sort of the coalface, so to speak. So what's the, when are the FAQs going to be available, and what are we, what's the plan for getting them out into the arm's length bodies? You still there, John? Okay, Alasdair, do you want to just comment on that first? I don't know what feedback
I will do. Hopefully John is able to join us. I believe, but obviously oh,
are you there, John?
Sorry, yeah, I think I was unmuting as the hosts were unmuting as well, so apologies.
Oh dear, right, so did you get the question? It was around the publication of the FAQs, and also what are we doing through CCS to get these out to the likes of Network Rail to make sure that they are fully aware of these new rules?
Of course, so there is an existing FAQs document already published on gov.uk for PPN 0220. It is generic, covering common goods and services. So the more specific construction one is being developed at the moment, and we hope to publish those early next week. In terms of a plan to roll these out, clearly they'll go on gov.uk as a first port of call where all the supporting resources go. But we're also engaging all of the departments as well. So we'll start with the 17 CG departments and then roll that through to the dependencies, the arm's length bodies, etc., to make sure they have visibility of what this guidance is. We're also going to hold a forum with the local authorities, local resilience forums through MHCLG, to make sure that they are getting the most up-to-date information and they know where to find it.
I was going to say, these are publicly available as well. So presumably if you're working with a client and you don't think they're quite aware, or perhaps they're not acting, in a way that's consistent with the PPNs, people can flag them, can't they? They're all available. It shouldn't be it's not anything that sort of has to come from CCS, so to speak.
Absolutely, yeah. So the publicly available on the gov.co.uk, anybody can access those, whether government departments or whether members of the public or parts of the supply chain, and any feedback, any questions or concerns that anybody has on those can direct those to the info@crown-commercial.gov.uk email address. So the point I was trying to make before was this: be patient as we develop these. This is unprecedented times, and this will be an iterative process, so we're more than happy to receive that feedback and improve upon what's already gone out there in its current state.
No, that's brilliant. Thank you very much, John. So just on the same question, really, Alasdair, what are you seeing in terms of clients picking up on these, and what feedback are you getting, if any, from members about how they're being applied yet?
Well, the interesting thing is the case study of Network Rail was one of the earliest that we saw coming out and saying that they would be paying invoices on approval, which sort of showed that they had responded to the PPN quite quickly. We've written to a lot of our major clients. Generally speaking, the indication is that they are enacting some of the provisions in relation to the PPN. A bit of a mixed picture. I think almost the further you get away from central government, the less likely we're seeing action. But I think that's almost as a result of it taking longer for the message to get in rather than a lack of desire. I think most customers do recognise that if they don't do anything to support their suppliers, they won't have suppliers when things return. That's not to say that we haven't seen some poor practice. I'm not going to say who, but yes, there have definitely been a couple who have pretty much ignored the guidance and have said that they're going to. But by and large, we're seeing reasonably good practice. And I think what would be good for us as industry is to celebrate where we are seeing customers do the right thing, because that helps make the case with others that are still sort of working out what their approach to this is going to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, because it is new to them as well, so they probably, albeit they've got this really good guidance from CCS, you can imagine some of the clients feeling a little bit uncomfortable about such a big change to their payment practices.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got a question in relation to the a client that is opening and closing sites. So clearly, as we've said, this is quite an unprecedented situation. So it will take a while for clients to work out the rules around when their site should be open, when they should not be open. In this case, they've had a client that is moving to open and close the site, or has done a couple of times, and they're concerned about what it means for them as a contractor in relation to penalties. So if the client is making that decision to open and close the site, have we got a view on how that, in line with this guidance, how that should be reflected in terms of contractual penalties? That's to both of you.
Yeah, so I think, well, my perspective is any organisation, any business employer needs to act in accordance with Public Health England. So they're going to have to make tough decisions, but safety is the first priority. It's got to be. Of course, the knock-on effect of making those decisions is unknown. To Alasdair's point there, the impact of making those are unknown largely at the moment. So hence the reason why we try to provide an outline, a framework of what type of relief options are available. Whether that's a relief on penalties, shouldn't use the phrase really, should more be around incentives, but I absolutely get that there's delay damages linked to some milestones and what have you, but that has to be considered in the decision that employer or business is making at the point they close that site, and the guidance needs to be clear from them based on the relief provisions in PPN 220 to support those impacted at that stage.
Okay, so it's definitely worth a conversation, because in principle there are provisions to cover that sort of disruption within the PPN.
Yes.
Brilliant. Okay, no, that's really helpful to know. Alice, did you have anything to add on that? Any other sort of observations, feedback around that? Other people in a similar situation?
I think the key point there will be, obviously, it will depend on the nature of your contract, all contracts being different. But yes, I think PPN 220 is quite helpful on this, giving some guidance to both sides as to, in these unusual circumstances, how they should operate. Okay,
no, that's really helpful. John, we've got a question for you around, you mentioned in your presentation potential future PPNs, and obviously this is a bit of a moving feast. So there's a question around how are you in CCS and Cabinet Office working with the central government departments around developing future PPNs?
So we collectively with government departments work with the Government Construction Board in assessing and discussing and preempting and trying to hypothetically work through scenarios that we have to discuss and then have to agree on what potentially needs to be done moving forward. Now, we haven't got a crystal ball, so a lot of the situations we find ourselves are in a new to us all on an hour by hour daily basis. So as those topics are raised, then we have conversations with the departments and feed into those with Cabinet Office on any decisions likely to result in a new PPN, for example. I can't really be any more clearer than that, and I know that's not particularly helpful. But we do work really closely with the departments and the policy colleagues to develop and guide the best practice around a particular scenario that either comes to us at that particular time or we're trying to preempt.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that is helpful. It's quite reassuring as well to know that it's, I mean, not that you'd expect it to be, but actually where you're developing these, you're developing them in collaboration with the department so that they do feel some ownership towards them being able to sort of implement those with the arm's length bodies. So I think that's really, really good to know. Okay, I've got a question come in on furloughing. Every webinar we have questions on furloughing. It's my new favourite subject. I'll take this one. So this one is, if the supply chain chooses not to work when social distancing is possible, are there any implications in respect of their right to furlough staff as a result? So in terms of this and applying furloughing specifically to the construction sector, there is some guidance that the Construction Leadership Council published yesterday, which does actually set out a process for working out whether or not you're eligible to furlough your staff. But at a very, very high level, if in accordance with the CRC's safe operating procedures, if you can't comply with those and therefore you're not able to work because it is not, safe for you to work, then you would be in a position to furlough your staff. And equally, you can furlough your staff if you don't have enough capacity, if you don't have enough pipeline of work. So maybe even if you could work safely, if say something else is paused on the site and therefore you haven't got that pipeline and therefore you've got a shortfall in your income, on that basis, again, you would be eligible to furlough your staff. So, okay, I've got a question around progressing design during this process, or during this sort of disruption period. So, what have we got in terms of, and this is probably to both of you, so be aware, where you're looking to progress a design, perhaps because you can continue to work, but you're going to have to maybe take more risks because you're having to make more assumptions around not being able to access site or not being able to carry out some of your surveys. If you're working in that space as a designer, how would that be dealt with in terms of these sort of provisions? So it may be that you can continue to work, but that perhaps your deliverable may be with a few more caveats on it. How would that work in relation to the guidance and the dispensations in the PPN? And equally, Alasdair, from a contractor's viewpoint. So John, did you want to just comment first?
Yeah, of course. I guess it's got to be unique to the request that you're working on, or the type of work that you're working on. And back to Alasdair's point there, the T's and C's wrapped around that as well. From a PPM perspective, the guidance or the wording itself is around relief for payment. So there could be a situation where there's a milestone that needs to be achieved, and that becomes relaxed, pushed back, or split in two to become two milestones to achieve completion of one over the other. But these are all hypothetical situations, and it's got to be project specific. I think for me, there's it's Alasdair's point that he raised earlier. All parties need to work collaboratively and in a pragmatic way to continue the progress of any design, of any project, whatever it is, in a safe manner, and allow organisations to still maintain that ability to be involved in the project to achieve the deliverables ultimately that this has had to do at the point that the project was awarded for them.
No, that's brilliant, and we do appreciate on this call. Obviously, you're not there looking at the contracts, and this is generalities. But yeah, as you say, some of the options there might be open to that particular. So as you say, like perhaps splitting the deliverables into an interim design and a later date, a final design, or those sorts of things would certainly be worth a conversation.
Of course. And what we can do, I think we know the questions obviously that are coming in, and I don't know whether we're responding to them formally outside of this, but we're happy to have a review of those. I'm conscious that Sam was on the call, is having technical difficulties. We might be able to provide responses as well in support.
That's all right. You're filling in admirably, John. So, Alasdair, from a contractor's perspective, what would be in that kind of relationship with your designer? Have you got any thoughts on that?
Well, first and foremost, I think we should say, as a whole industry, wherever it's possible to get stuff done during this period in terms of design, that's got to be the best thing to do, because otherwise we're not just going to have the shutdown during this period of crisis, but also out at the other end as well, because there won't have been anything ready to go when we get to the other end. However, I do recognise the challenge here in terms of whoever your customer is, whether it's a traditional client or whether it's a tier 1 contractor. I think it's what John said. You have to have that conversation about what you can feasibly deliver and whether that is going to meet the brief or whether the brief can be flexed. And then wherever the gaps are can be filled in once we get back to something closer to normality.
No, that's brilliant. No, thank you. And I think that's absolutely right. I mean, that's certainly the message coming out from government, isn't it? And from the Secretary of State is we do want to continue working where it's safe to do so. And you would say that actually design work done remotely is something that falls into that category of being able to progress at least to some level. So it would be a shame to sort of pause that for some of these reasons. Okay. John, a question for you around, dare I say policing, but not really policing, but I think it's a question around actually looking at what departments can do to check that some of these provisions, some of these measures to support cash flowing into the industry are actually being cascaded, are actually being implemented by the arm's length bodies and then cascaded from there. I don't know, I mean, this is obviously issued as guidance, but is there anything that you're aware of, or are there plans for anything in terms of monitoring feedback of how they're being implemented with the departments?
So that responsibility is going to lie with the department. So there's probably two strands to that question. One is how is it practically being applied? And the onus will be on the department to, to ensure that any money is released in perspective of any relief provisions, those flow through the supply chain, and those every tier is getting what they should be getting. From an audit perspective, that's down to the true contract management of any project that is ongoing and shouldn't really change. Clearly, where we're moving from a lump sum type arrangement to an open book, i.e. Everybody being open and transparent and fair and reasonable, then we've got to put measures in to audit those and flow those through. The second part, I think, was around feedback. So how are we feeding back, or how are we gathering feedback that this is actually happening and the departments are actually auditing it and the supply chain is actually delivering against those. So we're pulling together a contractual or commercial management type working group with all the commercial directors across government to cover off similar things like this. I think Alice has raised the point a couple of times now. Everybody really needs to be open and collaborative, and to be fair, the way the public and industries generally have been pulling together in trying to help this current situation is phenomenal. I'm personally really heartened by it. So there's no reason why is in specific sectors or industries that we can't do the same. Ultimately government is going out on a limb to help the suppliers in these situations by breaking down the barriers that exist today. For the right reasons at the time of entering into contract. means that we need to relax those provisions, but it comes down to trust. And my personal view, there's often an issue of trust in the construction industry up and down the supply chain. So maybe as a positive, we might get to a situation outside of this that trust is rebuilt significantly, you know, and the industry improves as well from it. But I guess the key point to take away from that is as commercial functions, or as a commercial function, we obviously are linking with every commercial director in every department, and we're establishing this working group to gather all of this feedback.
Brilliant. Okay, and I think that's, you know, that's really great as well that we have the opportunity to feedback. And in particular, I know that, you know, myself and Alasdair are sort of speaking daily on these sorts of topics. So again, if you're, you know, a little bit nervous or uncomfortable with feeding back, you know, through your immediate client, you can always just, you know, sort of flag to us and we can collate general feedback as well. So I think that's, again, use your trade associations with that. Okay, we've got lots of questions, so I'm going to move us on. Right, this is a question for both of you, but a lot of the discussion has been around existing contracts, projects already in progress. What advice would you give to somebody about to commence a major works procurement? So I think that's probably to John first and then to Alasdair.
Thanks for coming to me first.
I'll get to Alasdair first. We'll go to Alasdair first. Go on, Alasdair. I know that you'll be having a view on this.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it's something actually we would say, regardless of whether this was happening or not, the first thing you should do is speak to the market. Get an understanding of their capacity, their level of interest, their challenges, what they see as the risks, because actually that's just good practice. And if you do that, it'll very quickly bring up whether the industry will be able to respond effectively to any sort of competition that comes out. I think one of the challenges will be there is a mix in the way that individual companies have responded. So I suppose you wouldn't want to give a competitive advantage to one company purely because they've kept their bid teams on while another has furloughed them. So that's why I would say having that sort of market engagement is quite important, is to understand what the shape of the markets look like. But equally, we do want there to be work ready to go when we come out the other end of this. So actually, I would say almost for smaller works and stuff that's more immediate, having something that's going to be ready to go in 2-3 months' time, it may be a very good thing that industry would welcome coming out.
Okay, and John, did you want to add to that, just in relation to if somebody came to you now with a sort of large procurement to get off the ground?
I agree with Alasdair. I think market engagement, regardless of the context that we currently find ourselves in, is really important. There's always going to be opportunity to progress something in this context, and it's important that we speak to the market on that to make sure that something is achievable. But also, as Alasdair said, we need to, let's hope and pray this isn't here for too much longer, and we've got an industry and projects to deliver outside of this as well. So we've got to get ourselves ready for doing that. And I think the circumstance we're in, whether it's construction, whether it's anything else, we're having to adapt our lives and our approach to things so differently. And just plea that everybody does that in the right way, and everybody does it collaboratively.
Okay, no, that's helpful, and I think it's a good steer, and it's the same actually that we're hearing again from the ministers, is that as much as possible we need to prepare to come back to work, when normality hits. So like you say, that's as much as we can feasibly do that and get the pipeline moving, the better. Okay, John, you're very popular. There's another question in relation to PPN 02. So this one, I think it relates to the fact that in it you talk about, or in it there's discussion around key suppliers and suppliers at risk. And the question is it intended for relief through this PPN to be provided for smaller suppliers, such as those that supply low value materials or consumables, rather than just applying this to perhaps larger contracts? So I don't know if you've got a view on that.
Again, it always depends on the particular project or contract in place. So if you took the example from a client perspective, they've got to assess, based on the critical nature of their project, what's a critical member of the supply chain in that project and how far that goes down to the tiers. You know, so I'm apologies for kind of being hypothetical again, really, without knowing the specifics of a particular project, but that decision needs to be made on balance based on the project's specifics and the contract T's and C's that are there, and the dependency on the levels of and layers of supply chain in order to deliver things.
But it doesn't discriminate against the size of the contract. So actually, if when you review your portfolio of contracts, you have a really small by value contract that's really important, that, you know, the same provisions would apply to that as if you were, you know, procuring billions of pounds worth of civils works, for example.
Well, only a department will know what's a critical project to them and what isn't.
But if they deem it a critical project, it doesn't really matter on the size of the contract. It's more down to the department deciding which ones are critical contracts for them. Is that right? It's not a sort of de minimis on it's got to be above a certain level of spend or anything.
Yeah, so it comes down to the project specifics and the criticality of that project to that department at that time, and the scale will differ depending on the department.
Yeah, okay. No, that's helpful to know. Thank you. All right, so we've got lots of questions. I'm just scrolling through. Do we think we're going to see changes to contract terms? So say if we are in this and we are awarding contracts, and I don't know, again, whether we've got, you know, thoughts on if we've got procurements that are live and perhaps going to conclude. So are we likely to see changes to the contract terms? I mean, I guess that might be a topic for a future PPN, John. I don't know, in terms of, you know, those sorts of questions that you're must be getting from clients now.
Yeah, so I don't know at this stage, to be honest. Apologies, I can't be any more clearer than that on this. I don't know is the honest answer at this stage.
No, that's fair enough. No, it's fine. And I think some of it is, you know, we don't know, this is unprecedented, so it's no problem. But I think it's worth, you know, again, that's the sort of thing that is worth giving that feedback on, is that, you know, there might be a concern in the industry that is the case. So, you know, it's worth just having that conversation between us, isn't it? Okay, right, let me have a look. So we've got quite a few questions. So Alasdair, we've got a question around ground investigation and whether it's feasible for that to go ahead. I don't know if you just want to touch a little bit on some of the safe operating procedures that we have, so that people are aware of the guidance that's already out there.
Okay, so that's an interesting question. It depends, as with all these things, on the nature of the individual job. I would say that some GI sounds like it could be possible, but, you know, we've got these site operating procedures in place, and you would have to look to that and say, can we feasibly do everything within that job without there being people more than 2 meters, less than 2 meters apart, and all of the other provisions in there. There's an interesting discussion at the minute around that 2 meters point, but I think as we stand here today, the current position is that is the view of the Construction Leadership Council. We will keep that under review. However, can it go ahead? I think also you need to consider not just while you're on the site, but getting to site, and whether that can be done without you know, people being in close contact with each other. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm not a ground engineer. I don't know the specifics. Sorry, ground investigator, so I don't know the specifics of the role. But it's one of those things that I could imagine, depending on the location, might be viable to go ahead.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I guess it's a case of taking the guidance that's been produced by the CLC and just incorporating that into your site risk assessment in the same way that you would with any other risk, isn't it? It's a slightly more of an unknown risk to try and manage. But I think that, you know, the guidance is quite helpful in setting out almost the red lines within that. So, like you say, we'd have to do it on a sort of site by site basis.
Yeah.
Okay, right. Last question, John, because you've been very, very accommodating with us so far. This one is in relation to contract performance and in relation to force majeure specifically. Now, I know this is mentioned in the PPN, so could you just elaborate a little bit more on that specifically, and how that would be sort of treated or could be treated differently under the PPN that's been issued?
Again, this is going to be specific to the project and the T's and C's involved. So I think the PPN is clear in the supply relief provisions available and being offered. As we know, with any force majeure type clause, it has implications. It's the consequence of a force majeure event are dotted throughout any terms and conditions, and they could have been changed as well or amended by clients and the supply chain members. So I can't comment specifically on that. It really does depend on what the current position is on the project, the criticality of it, and of course we're not in a position to kind of set any precedents here. We are in an unprecedented time, so we're from a government perspective, I think the PPN is trying to be as fair and as transparent as it can possibly be. And like I've said, it's an iterative process, so we'll be exposed as an industry to things that change on a daily basis or things that we find out, and we need to absorb those and amend any guidance as necessary.
Yeah, and I think just to check, just check my understanding while I've got you. It does. I think it's very, very well worded actually in the PPN to sort of say, yes, you can look at force majeure, you can look at contractual sort of, ramifications of this, but actually it's, and if you go down that route, then fair enough. But actually, it's almost worth a conversation first, and it's worth a conversation around the provisions and the flexibilities that the PPN introduces for clients. So I think it's, like you said, it's not a sort of specific or a site specific or a contract specific answer, but actually it's sort of trying to, provide you a bit of encouragement to say, look, before you go to that, have a conversation with your client. Is that the right interpretation?
Absolutely. Yeah, and have a conversation with CCS. Come through the info at crowncommercial.gov.uk website if you need to. Mm-hmm. We also act as that intermediary between supply chains and departments, and can offer that support to any of the suppliers, the contractors that operate in the industry today. We're happy to do that, but obviously any way through any of these difficult situations starts with a conversation. It's got to.
Brilliant. And there we go. Absolutely. Collaboration in action. Right. Yeah. I think that's it. So I think we're out of time now. But thank you ever so much, both of you as our panelists for taking us through the presentations, but actually really adding a lot of detail to those documents and to the guidance that's out there already. I think that really brings it to life for people. I really appreciate you taking the time. I know that you must both be really, really busy. Thank you very much to all of our participants for sending your questions in. We didn't quite get through all of them, so we will follow up with those of you that we didn't get to answer on the call, but thank you very much for your participation. And just to flag up, obviously we're going to record this so you can watch it back. We've got 2 others already booked in the series, so please do sign up or encourage your colleagues to sign up. So just thanks again, Alasdair and John, really appreciate your inputs. And actually, from what is perhaps quite a potentially depressing situation, there is an awful lot of good work coming out of this and an awful lot of learning I think we can take forward into our business as usual around collaboration, around perhaps a fairer and more balanced contractual relationship. So both, thank you very much. Really appreciate you taking the time.
Okay, thanks Hannah. Stay safe and well, everybody.
Yeah, thanks Hannah.
Thanks all. Bye.